The fluorescent lights in the hotel kitchen had been flickering for 3 days, and nobody had fixed them yet. Evelyn Cross noticed things like that. She noticed the way the flicker landed hardest over the prep station where the new dishwasher worked. A man named Julius Garner, and how he never once looked up to complain about it, just kept moving, kept scrubbing, kept his head down with a kind of focused quiet that felt different from the other guys on the line. Different in a way she couldn't name yet. She wasn't supposed to be in the kitchen. Evelyn was the owner of the Alderton Grand, a boutique hotel in downtown Columbus that had taken her 11 years to build from a bankrupt property nobody else wanted into something that mattered. She had a general manager for the day-to-day, she had department heads and shift supervisors, and a very competent HR director named Sonia who handled hiring. Evelyn was supposed to be in meetings, or on calls, or reviewing the renovation proposal for the East Wing. But she'd walked through the kitchen at 7 that morning because the coffee on the executive floor tasted wrong, and she wanted to check the new beans herself, and then she'd stayed longer than she meant to. Julius Garner moved like a man who had learned not to take up too much space. He was somewhere in his early 40s, she guessed, with close-cropped gray at his temples and hands that looked like they'd done harder work than this. He didn't talk much. The other guys on the morning shift bantered and complained and played music off someone's phone, and Julius just worked alongside them, occasionally nodding, occasionally offering a short laugh, but mostly just present. Steady. She watched him help one of the younger line cooks, a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, lift a heavy stockpot without being asked. The kid said thanks. Julius said sure thing and went back to what he was doing. Evelyn left the kitchen and tried to forget about it. She couldn't. 3 weeks earlier, Julius Garner had walked into the Alderton Grand in a different capacity. He'd come for a management interview, facilities coordinator, a role that oversaw maintenance, vendor contracts, and the housekeeping department. It was a good position, good salary, the kind of job that gave a person back some of the ground they'd lost. Sonia had conducted the interview. She'd sent Evelyn the notes afterward, the way she always did for management-level positions, because Evelyn liked to stay close to hiring even when she wasn't in the room. The notes were brief. Candidate has relevant experience but significant employment gap. 4 years unaccounted for. Hesitant to elaborate. Does not present with the confidence required for a leadership role. Not advancing. Evelyn had read it, moved on, and thought nothing more of it, until she saw him in her kitchen 3 days later in a gray uniform, scrubbing hotel pans at $6 above minimum wage. He had come back, not to argue, not to complain. He'd applied for the dishwasher position quietly, through the regular portal, and showed up on time on his first day, and said nothing to anyone about the interview that hadn't gone the way he'd hoped. Evelyn thought about that for a long time. Julius Garner had not planned to come back. He'd driven home from the Alderton Grand on the afternoon of the interview with the window cracked despite the October cold because he needed the air. He needed something to fill his chest that wasn't the feeling of watching a woman half his age scan his resume with the particular expression of someone trying to find a polite way to say no. The question had come early. What were you doing between 2019 and 2023? He'd paused. That was the problem, the pause. He'd known the question was coming, had practiced his answer 100 times in the parking lot of his apartment building, had said the words out loud to his reflection in the bathroom mirror at 6 that morning. I was the primary caregiver for my mother, who had Alzheimer's. She passed in March of 2023. I've spent the past year rebuilding, clean, honest, nothing to be ashamed of. But in the room under those lights, with the woman's pen hovering over his resume like a verdict, the words had come out wrong. Fragmented, quiet. He'd said something about family obligations and left the details unspoken, because the real details were private, were sacred, were not something he was willing to offer up to a stranger in exchange for a job title. She'd moved on quickly after that, asked about his leadership style, asked where he saw himself in 5 years, asked with the careful neutrality of someone trained in HR whether he felt he was ready to step back into a demanding professional environment. Julius had looked at her and thought about his mother on the bad days, the days when she didn't know his face, when she asked for his father who'd been dead for 20 years, when he'd sat beside her bed at 2 in the morning and held her hand and talked to her about things she might not hear, but he needed to say anyway. He thought about what those 4 years had asked of him and what they had given him, and he thought about the particular kind of strength you build when no one is watching and there's no applause at the end. He had not said any of that. He'd thanked her for her time and walked out. The drive home was long. When he got back to the apartment, the one he'd moved into after selling his mother's house to cover the last of her medical bills, his daughter was sitting on the front steps. Naomi was 12, sharp-eyed and serious in the way she'd been since she was small, the kind of child who noticed things and stored them quietly for later. She looked up when she saw him and said, "How'd it go?" Julius sat down on the step beside her. He didn't answer right away. "Dad, it went okay," he said. She looked at him the way she always did when she knew he wasn't telling the whole truth. She didn't push. She just leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, and they sat there in the cooling afternoon, and Julius thought about the light bill that was due on Friday and the fact that Naomi needed new sneakers and that he had exactly $412 in checking and no job to speak of. He went back online that night. The Alderton Grand had a listing for a kitchen utility position. He stared at it for a long time. It paid $11 less an hour than the coordinator role. It was third shift, which meant he'd have to rearrange Naomi's school pickup. It required no interview, just a background check and 2 references. He applied at 11:15 at night and fell asleep at his kitchen table with his laptop still open. The thing Evelyn noticed the second time she watched Julius work was the way he handled a problem. It was a Thursday morning, and there was a situation in the kitchen. One of the vendors had delivered the wrong size linen napkins for a banquet that evening, and the banquet coordinator was spiraling, and 3 different people were on their phones at once trying to fix it. And the noise level in the back corridor had risen to the kind of pitched anxiety that spreads like weather. Julius was not involved. It was not his department. He was off the clock, actually. She saw him check his watch and head toward the locker room, and then stop. He stopped, turned back, listened for a moment to the coordinator, explaining the situation to the receiving manager, and said quietly, "There's a linen service on Markham Street. They do same day if you call before 10. I use them when I manage the conference facilities over at Dunmore." The banquet coordinator turned to look at him. "Used to manage the conference facilities," Julius said, with a small, careful emphasis on the past tense, and then he gave her the number from memory and went to get his jacket. Evelyn had been standing 15 feet away. She pulled out her phone and wrote down the name Dunmore. Conference facilities. She sent Sonia a message that night. "Pull the full application for Julius Garner, the dishwasher. I want everything he submitted." The application was thorough. More thorough than most of the management applications she received. His work history before the gap was substantial. 12 years in hospitality and facilities management, the last 4 of which had been as operations director at a mid-size convention center. He'd overseen a staff of 31. He'd managed a budget north of $2 million. The resume was clear and specific and documented with the kind of precision that came from someone who had actually done the work, not someone describing it from the outside. Evelyn read it twice. Then she read Sonia's interview notes again, hesitant to elaborate. Does not present with the confidence required for a leadership role. She thought about confidence. She thought about what confidence looked like from the outside, and what it sometimes hid, and what its absence sometimes meant. She thought about the stock pot and the linen service on Markham Street, and the way Julius Garner moved through a room like someone who had learned, at some cost, that the work mattered more than the recognition. She called Sonia at 8 the next morning. "I want to sit down with Julius Garner," she said. "Informally, can you set it up?" There was a pause on the other end. "He applied for the dishwasher position, Evelyn, not management." "I know what he applied for," Evelyn said. "Set it up." Julius was in the middle of his shift when one of the kitchen supervisors came to find him and said, with an expression that suggested she wasn't entirely sure what was happening either, that Mrs. Cross wanted to speak with him in the side office off the main corridor. He took off his gloves. He dried his hands. He tried to think of anything he might have done wrong and came up short, which was either a good sign or irrelevant. The side office was small, a round table, 4 chairs, a window that looked out at the loading dock. Evelyn Cross was already there when he arrived. She was shorter than he'd expected for someone whose name was on the building. She gestured to the chair across from her without preamble and said, "Sit down, please. I'm not going to waste your time." He sat. "I reviewed your full application," she said. "I want to understand the 4-year gap." Julius looked at her. He recognized the question. He recognized the room, the table, the particular weight of someone deciding whether he was worth the risk. He had sat in this room before, in different buildings with different people, and come away with nothing. He thought about Naomi on the front steps. He thought about his mother's voice on the good days, clear and warm, calling him by name. "My mother had Alzheimer's," he said. "I was her only family. I moved in with her in 2019, and I cared for her until she died in March of 2023. Full time. I handled her finances, her medications, her doctors, her daily needs. I didn't work because I couldn't work, and I'm not ashamed of it. But I've found that it doesn't translate well in a 20-minute interview, so I've gotten in the habit of saying less about it than I should." He stopped. He hadn't planned to say all of that. Evelyn Cross was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me about Dunmore." He told her about Dunmore. He told her about the renovation project he'd managed in 2017 that had come in under budget and 6 weeks ahead of schedule. He told her about the staffing crisis they'd had in 2018 and how he'd rebuilt the housekeeping and maintenance teams in 4 months. He told her about the systems he'd put in place and the vendors he'd cultivated and the ways he'd learned to see a building the way a surgeon sees a body, not as a structure, but as a set of interdependent systems, each one affecting the others. He talked for 14 minutes. He knew it was 14 minutes because he watched the clock on the wall out of habit. Evelyn didn't look at her phone once. When he finished, she was quiet again. Then she said, "The facilities coordinator position is still open. We gave a verbal to someone who withdrew last week. I'd like you to come back in for a formal conversation with my general manager." Julius looked at her. "I have a shift this afternoon." "I know," she said. "I'm asking you to consider both tracks until we've had that conversation. Your position here is secure either way." "I want to be clear about that." He nodded slowly. "One more thing," she said, and her voice shifted slightly, became less transactional. "I watched you in the kitchen this week. The linen vendor, the kid with the stock pot. You were off the clock both times." Julius said nothing. "That's not a small thing," Evelyn said. "I want you to know I saw it." He drove home that afternoon with the window cracked again, but the feeling in his chest was different this time. Not deflated. Not hollow. Something that hadn't been there in a while. Something that took him a moment to name. He stopped at the corner store and bought 2 packs of Naomi's favorite gum, the watermelon kind she'd been rationing, because he'd told her the pack had to last the week. He didn't tell her why. He just handed it to her when she got off the school bus and watched her look at him with that sharp, searching expression she had. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing yet," he said. "Maybe something. We'll see." She studied him for another moment and then tore open the gum and said, without looking up, "You seem like yourself." Julius didn't answer. He just stood there on the sidewalk in the afternoon light and let that settle over him. "You seem like yourself," and thought about how long it had been since someone had said that and meant it as a good thing. The formal interview with Harlan Shaw, the Alderton Grand's general manager, was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Julius wore the same jacket he'd worn to the first interview, the one he'd bought for his mother's funeral and worn twice since. Harlan was a tall man in his late 50s with the careful, organized energy of someone who had been running hotels his entire adult life. He asked thorough questions. He took notes. He asked Julius to walk him through a hypothetical vendor dispute and a hypothetical staffing shortage and a hypothetical budget overrun, and Julius answered each one directly, without hedging, pulling from things he had actually done rather than things he imagined he might do. At the end, Harlan leaned back and said, "Your background is strong. I want to be honest with you. There were concerns after the first interview. Not about your competence. About fit, I understand," Julius said. "I don't think those concerns were well-founded," Harlan said. "I think you're exactly the kind of person who should be running this department. But I want to ask you directly, are you ready for this? Not whether you're capable. I can see you're capable. Are you ready?" Julius thought about the question the way he took everything. carefully, from all sides, without rushing toward an answer he hadn't earned. He thought about his mother, and the years in her house, and the slow erosion of everything he'd built professionally, and the strange gifts those years had given him in exchange. Patience, attention, the ability to stay calm inside chaos because he'd already survived worse chaos than this. He thought about Naomi's face when he handed her the gum. He thought about Evelyn Cross saying, "I saw it." "Yes," he said. "I'm ready." He started the following Monday. The first month was hard in the ways he'd expected and hard in ways he hadn't. The facilities team had been running loosely under a part-time supervisor who'd departed on bad terms, and the maintenance logs were a mess. And two of the vendors were overcharging on contracts that hadn't been reviewed in 3 years. Julius worked long hours. He took the job seriously in the way he took everything seriously, which meant he asked questions before making decisions and made decisions before making enemies, and built trust slowly and on purpose. The flickering light over the prep station got fixed on his 4th day. He hired a technician for the HVAC system that had been flagged 3 times in 18 months. He renegotiated the cleaning supply contract and saved the hotel $11,000 in the first quarter. He learned all 32 members of his staff by name inside the first 2 weeks, and not just their names, their schedules, their situations, which ones were reliable, and which ones needed steadier management, and which ones. Like the young dishwasher who'd helped him with the stockpot before he knew Julius was anything other than a coworker, were quietly stronger than they appeared. He made mistakes, too, a vendor decision in the 2nd month that cost them time, a communication breakdown with the banquet team that he had to walk back and repair. He owned both without drama and moved forward, because that was the only direction that mattered. Evelyn stopped by the facilities office occasionally, never announced, never with an agenda, just passing through in the way she passed through all her departments. She'd ask a question or two, listen to the answer, and leave. She never told him she was pleased with his work in so many words. She didn't need to. The way she listened was enough. In December, the Alderton Grand had its best quarter in 6 years. Harlan mentioned it in the all-staff meeting. He credited the operations department specifically. Julius sat in the back row and felt the attention land on him and didn't shift in his seat or deflect it. He let himself receive it quietly, the way he received most things. Without drama, without performance, without pretending it didn't matter. It mattered. On the Friday before Christmas, Julius picked Naomi up from school himself, something he hadn't been able to do for the first 2 months, when his hours were too unpredictable. She came out of the building with her backpack on both shoulders and her headphones around her neck and stopped on the sidewalk when she saw his car instead of the usual bus. She got in without comment and set her bag on the floor and looked straight ahead through the windshield for a moment. "You got off early," she said. "Comp time," he said, "for all the Saturdays." She nodded. He drove. They got burgers from the place on 5th she liked, the one with the crinkle fries, and ate in the parking lot because it was cold and neither of them wanted to find a table. Naomi ate half her fries and then reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out without ceremony. Julius unfolded it. It was a card she'd made, the kind she used to make when she was younger. Construction paper, markers, slightly crooked text. On the front, she'd drawn a building that was clearly meant to be a hotel, based on the stick figure with a mop she'd also drawn nearby, which he decided not to take personally. Inside, in her careful handwriting, she had written, "I know this year was hard, and I know you were scared sometimes even when you didn't say so. But you did it anyway. That's the part I'll remember." Julius read it twice. Then he folded it carefully, the way you fold something you intend to keep, and slid it into his jacket pocket without speaking, because there was nothing to say that the folding hadn't already said. Naomi ate another fry. "The hotel looks nice, by the way." "I Googled it." "You Googled it? I wanted to see where you work," she shrugged. "It has good reviews. Someone called it impeccably maintained. I had to look up what impeccably meant," Julius laughed. It came out easy, the way laughs did now, more often than before. "What does it mean?" she asked. "Perfectly," he said, "without flaws." Naomi considered this. "That seems like a lot of pressure." "It does," he agreed. "But you aim for it anyway." She looked at him from the corner of her eye the way she did when she was deciding whether something was worth saying. Then she said, "That sounds like you." Julius drove home through the early winter dark, the card folded in his pocket and the heater running and his daughter beside him, working through the last of her fries. And he thought about what it cost to stay in a room when everything in you wanted to leave, and what it gave back eventually. Not as reward, exactly, but as something quieter, something more durable. The knowledge that you had not looked away from the thing that needed doing, and that somewhere along the way in the doing of it, you had found your way back to yourself. Some doors take longer to open. Some people have to knock twice. That doesn't mean they don't belong inside. It just means the door hadn't met them yet. Julius Garner knew that now. He'd stopped waiting for someone to tell him it was true.